Rebuilding a Fleet, Rebuilding a Life, a Dream and a 17-Year Health Research Journey, number 1697, June 23, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, Research Journey. Preface for readers: eat more protein and fresh vegetables. Eat less red meat and processed food. Reduce portions if overweight. Eating a little less will not hurt you. Overeating for years will. Exercise daily. Walk at least 7,000 to 8,000 steps. Drink 85 to 100 ounces to 0.5 to 3.0 liters of water daily. Sleep 6 to 7 hours each night. Manage stress. Avoid draining people and unnecessary conflicts. Put your health first. Wealth, fame, and power mean little without health and life. Introduction. Last night, I slept 8.5 hours and experienced one of the most vivid dreams I have had in many years. In the dream, I returned to an engineering laboratory at MIT. A team of engineers, scientists, naval architects, and researchers were engaged in a remarkable project. Our mission was to rebuild and modernize the naval fleet of the 19th-century British Empire. We were not simply restoring historical ships as museum pieces. Instead, we were attempting to understand how they were originally designed, why they worked, where their limitations existed, and how modern engineering principles could improve them. The dream was extraordinarily detailed. Even after waking around 7 o'clock in the morning, I could still visualize the laboratory, the drafting tables, the engineering drawings, the shipyard, the prototype construction process, and the ocean trials. As I reflected on the dream, I gradually realized that it was not really about ships. It was about the past 17 years of my health research journey. Rebuilding the Battleship. Inside the MIT laboratory, the project began with studying the original naval vessels. We examined every structural component: the hull, the masts, the sails, the rigging, the rivets, the support beams, the joints connecting one structural member to another. We reviewed historical designs and engineering records. We discussed how 19th-century engineers selected materials, how they managed structural loading, and how they compensated for the limitations of available technology. Some members of the team focused on wood structures, others focused on steel reinforcement. We studied how wooden beams behaved under long-term loading. We examined deformation caused by wind, waves, humidity, temperature changes, and repeated stress cycles accumulated over many years. The discussions naturally expanded into engineering mechanics. Elasticity described how structures recovered after loading. Plasticity described permanent deformation. Viscoplasticity described long-term deformation under continuous stress. Finite element methods were applied to evaluate stress concentrations throughout the ship structure. We investigated how forces traveled from the sails into the masts, from the masts into the hull, and ultimately into the water. Every component mattered. A small rivet could influence an entire structural system. A minor weakness in one connection could eventually become a major failure point during a storm. The dream emphasized a principle that every engineer understands. A complex system often fails not because of one large defect, but because of the interaction of many smaller factors accumulated over time. From design to ocean testing, the dream then moved from theory into experimentation. After completing the designs, we constructed prototype vessels. The prototypes were launched into the ocean. This was the most vivid part of the dream. The ships were no longer drawings. They became living experiments. We sailed them under a wide range of environmental conditions, from calm seas and moderate winds to rough waters and storm conditions. Sensors were installed throughout the vessels, allowing continuous collection of measurements related to hull stresses, mast deflections, sail loading, structural vibration, material fatigue, energy transfer, navigation performance, fuel efficiency, speed, and stability. Those data were transmitted back to the laboratory for analysis. Whenever discrepancy appeared between prediction and observation, the engineers returned to the design tables. The model was modified, the ship was redesigned, and another prototype was built. Additional tests were conducted, new data sets were collected, and the cycle repeated continuously. Design led to construction, construction led to testing. Testing led to measurement, measurement led to learning, and learning led to improvement. My dream emphasized that designing and manufacturing progress did not come from theory alone. Progress emerged from the combination of theory and collected evidence. The parallel health journey. When I awoke, I immediately recognized the similarity to my own medical journey during last 17 years since my age of 63. Beginning around 2010, I knowingly started building my own version of a naval research laboratory. The laboratory was my own body. The ship was my own health. The ocean was my real life. Instead of studying masts and rivets, I studied glucose, blood pressure, body weight, exercise, sleep, metabolism, and mortality diseases. Instead of measuring structural stresses on steel plates, I estimated vascular calcification and physiological stresses acting on my blood vessels. Instead of ocean storms, I faced obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular risk, chronic kidney disease, neuropathy, retinopathy, cardiac episodes, and eventually a hemorrhagic pontine stroke with seizures. The research methodology, however, was remarkably similar. I began by collecting data from every meal, every exercise session, every glucose reading, every blood pressure measurement, every body weight change, every sleep record, and every emotional up and down. Over time, the database expanded to more than 4 million data points. Gradually, complicated relationships among inputs and outputs began to emerge. I developed an AI-based medical software to estimate my carbohydrate intake grams from different foods. I then created mathematical models linking carbohydrate consumption to post-meal glucose behavior. The observations repeatedly confirmed that food quantity and quality strongly influenced my glucose responses. As the database expanded, additional relationships appeared. Body weight and glucose were closely linked. Body weight reduction consistently lowered my glucoses. Persistent exercise produced predictable glucose reductions. Meal portions generated measurable glucose increases and weight increases. Eventually, I discovered that average body weight could be used to estimate average glucose levels with reasonable accuracy. The data began to reveal the hidden engineering and biophysical structure of the human metabolic system. Building my physiological models just as engineers build mathematical models for ships, structures, and other high-technology products, I began constructing mathematical models for human health. My goal was never prediction alone. My goal was to achieve a deep understanding of the underlying causes, interactions, and responses that govern human physiology. Through these different math-physical modeling, I sought not only to estimate outcomes but also to understand the mechanisms that produce them. I wanted to understand how the system actually worked. Glucose became one major input variable, along with blood pressure, body weight, sleep quality, and exercise. As the database expanded and the analysis deepened, the relationships among these variables gradually evolved into a series of mathematical risk models, including models for cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, diabetes progression, and stroke risk. Eventually, the TSI stroke models inspired by Newton's law of motion emerged. The TSI models reflected an engineering viewpoint, rather than viewing pathophysiology as isolated variables. The models attempted to describe interacting forces, much like the masts, sail, hull, and rivets interact within a ship. Glucose, systolic blood pressure, pulse pressure, and vascular conditions interact within the human body, causing conditions such as stroke. The interaction is often more important than any single variable alone. The stroke as a structural failure event. 1 year ago, on June 21, 2025, I experienced a hemorrhagic pontine stroke. Looking backward, I now view that event through an engineering lens. The stroke was not a random occurrence. It resembled a structural failure event. The vulnerability developed gradually over 3.7 decades, the first 20 years, from 1990 through 2009, of poorly controlled type 2 diabetes under medications likely contributed approximately 91% of my accumulated vascular damage through progressive cerebral microvascular deterioration and calcification. In contrast, the following 17 years, from 2010 through 2026, were characterized by strict lifestyle management without medication intervention and substantially improved metabolic control. As a result, the ongoing metabolic stress during this period was dramatically reduced and likely contributed only about 9% of the accumulated vascular damage, viewed as a whole. The majority of the vascular injury was probably established during the earlier 2 decades of diabetes, while the later 17 years were primarily influenced by aging and served to slow further progression rather than reverse the existing structural damage. However, the accumulated structural vulnerability remained. The vessel had already experienced years of wear. The actual trigger involved a combination of mechanical forces, including systolic blood pressure, pulse pressure, acute stress, and the resulting vascular loading imposed on an already vulnerable vascular system. The final event occurred when long-term structural weakness and short-term mechanical stress converged. From an engineering perspective, The stroke resembled a fatigue failure occurring within a vulnerable structure. Similarities and differences. Dream of ship and reality of health shared many similarities. Both involved complex systems that required careful data measurement and mathematical modeling. Both depended on a continuous feedback process between theory and observation, and both demanded patience measured in years rather than days or weeks. Yet there was one profound difference. The ships in my dream were external objects. If a prototype failed, another could be built. The experiments could be repeated indefinitely. However, my health journey was different. I had only one brain, one vascular system, one body, and one life. The consequences of errors were real. And the stakes were much higher. The stroke was not simply a failed experiment. It was a life-threatening event. Nevertheless, the scientific process remained the same: observe, measure, analyze, learn, improve, and repeat. Conclusion: after reflecting on this vivid dream, I realized that it revealed an important continuity throughout my life. Although my academic and professional journey has spanned mathematics, physics, engineering, business administration, psychology, medicine, neuroscience, and pathophysiology, the underlying methodology has remained remarkably consistent. My engineering education trained me to begin with observation, collect data, identify measurable variables, construct models, test predictions, and continuously refine my understanding based on real-world evidence. The same approach that engineers use to design, build, and evaluate complex systems became the foundation of my 17-year health and medicine research journey. The dream of rebuilding 19th-century British naval vessels was therefore more than an interesting nighttime experience. It served as a metaphor for the work I have pursued for 26 years, including 9 years on psychology and 17 years on biomedicine. The ships represented complex systems. The ocean trials represented real-life testing. The collection and analysis of ship performance data mirrored the biomedical data that I have gathered and studied throughout my health journey. Perhaps the most meaningful realization is that the subjects have changed, but the way of thinking has not. Whether studying ships, semiconductor chips design, human psychology and personality disorders, metabolism, vascular health, or stroke recovery, the same math, physics, engineering mindset continues to guide my research work. Observe phenomena carefully, measure data objectively, think quantitatively, and seek to understand the underlying mechanisms behind observable phenomena. As I approach 80 years of age, I continue to follow the same process that first attracted me to mathematics, physics, and engineering 6 decades ago. The vessel has aged and encountered storms, damage, repairs, and unexpected challenges. Yet it remains afloat. Data continue to be collected, questions continue to be asked, and learning continues. In this sense, the dream was not about the past. It was a reflection of a lifelong habit of learning that continues to shape my journey today. Epilogue: an old Chinese saying states, in English, "What occupies the mind during the day often appears in dreams at night." As I reflected on the dream described in this article, I began to appreciate its deeper meaning. Although the dream was centered on rebuilding 19th-century British naval vessels inside an engineering laboratory, it was not truly about ships. It was about a way of thinking that has accompanied me throughout my life. For the past 26 years, I have devoted much of my time and energy to understanding the mechanics of human health, including both psychology and physiology. I have collected data, built mathematical models, tested hypotheses, compared predictions with observations, and continuously refined my understanding of metabolism, vascular health, neuroscience, and mortality disease progression. The methodology was remarkably similar to the engineering process portrayed in my dream. Perhaps the dream occurred because my mind was reviewing my journey that has now spanned nearly 3 decades. How engineering, medicine, neuroscience, psychology, and pathophysiology appear to be different disciplines. They share common foundation: the study of complex systems through observation, measurement, analysis, and learning. The dream lasted only one night. The journey itself continues. Perhaps the true message of both the dream and the reality it reflected is simple. The purpose was never simply to build the ship. The real purpose was to understand how the ship sails. Afterthought: in my view, psychology and physiology are not separate disciplines. They represent 2 sides of the same human health system. Psychology studies the mind, while physiology studies the body. Thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and biological functions continuously interact with one another. To understand human health fully, We must understand both. My recent stroke was a perfect example. The emotional stress from a real estate deal software elevated my blood pressure, which ruptured a micro blood vessel in my brain hardware. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.